Right, folks, little preamble before we jump into this episode. And the people watching on YouTube, this is a video episode, even though there's no video for this bit of me talking now. I'm having some technical issues, can't get my webcam working. I don't know what's up with it. I'm sure it's nothing major, but I can't be asked piss fighting about trying to fix it now. I just want to get this done and put the episode out. Secondly, so today's interview is with Dr. Diana Fleischman, and we're discussing the biological and psychological sex differences between men and women. So this interview I recorded all the way back in like September before I got ill, and I don't know what's happened in the meantime, whether it's shifting between different laptops or whatever, but I think the files got corrupted and the first 10 minutes of the interview were fucked. But luckily for us, the first 10 minutes of us recording just consisted of the two of us talking bollocks before we actually jumped into the conversation. So the only part missing is the bit where I introduce Diana. So I'm just going to do that now again. So Dr. Diana Fleischman is an evolutionary psychologist and senior lecturer at the University of Portsmouth, but currently on sabbatical and living in America. Her research interests include human sexuality, hormonal influences on the psychology of women, disgust, sensitivity, and evolutionary approaches to health, disease, and psychiatric disorders. She has authored numerous papers and book chapters on evolutionary psychology, and she runs the blog Dianaverse, which you can find at dianaverse.com. That's dianaverse.com. And she can be found on Twitter at Sentientist. That's at Sentientist. Figure it out for yourself, the spelling, if you can't understand it from my pronunciation. Pronunciation? How the fuck do you say that? Oh, there's no T in it. Pronunciation. Yeah, that wasn't right, was it? Pronunciation. Fuck me. Right, the other thing about this episode as well is back in September when we recorded this, I hadn't sort of fully jumped ship from the last iteration of the podcast. And so at the end of this episode, I include the old quickfire questions, which I've since abandoned. I haven't done them with any of the newer interviews. So I'd be interested to know if you guys would like me to resurrect that part of the old podcast to include in the new podcast. And when I say you guys, I mean the people who sponsor the podcast on Patreon. I couldn't give two shits what any of the freeloaders want. I'm not running a charity here. You know that old political slogan, no taxation without representation? Well, I'm all about the other, no representation without taxation. Unless you're helping me pay these hosting bills, enough with treating the YouTube comment section like it's a bleeding suggestion box. Nobody cares what you think I should do, least of all me. See you later.
Hell froze over, red rover, better get your moving for this snow get colder, for your soul get frozen. Am I supposed to let it go when my hopes get dashed by this bleak weather forecast?
All I wanted were some sunny days.
Right, here we go. Diana Fleischman, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me. Okay, you're the first guest on this new iteration of the podcast, by the way. I don't know if you'll actually be the first person to get published or anything. I need some other leading topics, but you're the first guest. And the reason that sort of matters is this is the first time I've ever sat down with a guest and not had a list of don't says. So whenever I used to prepare for the podcast before, yeah, because the podcast is primarily about the mental health sector, which it isn't anymore, folks. I inadvertently built up a very sort of sensitive audience who are all about trigger warnings and stuff. It feels weirdly sort of liberating that I haven't got my little post-it note here with don't say this, don't ask that. I'm just going to say whatever I want today, and we'll see where that lands the both of us, I think. Okay, so I think stick to the usual format will be if you just tell us a little bit about you and your history.
Sure.
Why evolutionary biology, psychology?
Yeah. My Wikipedia says that I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm not. I'm an evolutionary psychologist, but I'm very flattered to be called an evolutionary biologist because they have a bit more cred than evolutionary psychologists do. And also, you're not allowed to edit your own Wikipedia. Maybe I'm humble bragging. I was like, oh yeah, my Wikipedia. So yeah. But anyway, I'm an evolutionary psychologist. I'm American. I was raised in Atlanta, basically, but I'm first generation. Both my parents are from Europe. My mother's Portuguese, my dad's German. I was going to be a therapist when I was an undergrad. I was going to undergraduate at Oglethorpe University in Atlanta. And then I did a year abroad at the London School of Economics. And I studied with two people, Andy Wells for evolutionary psychology and Chris Badcock for psychoanalytic study of society. Or it was basically like Freud and Darwin kind of meet each other. Since then, he's not a Freudian anymore, but he had a lot of really interesting ideas. And I just totally fell in love with evolutionary psychology. It was probably good that I didn't become a therapist full time. I think I'd probably be a good like life coach because I could tell people what I think they should do. But I think therapists are just supposed to tell you, that they're listening. And I'm not so great at that. And then I really went crazy about that. And I went back to Atlanta. I worked for a year at an institute that did research on chimps that were symbol competent. So it's called the Language Research Center. They also had a bonobo breeding program at that time, but all those bonobos have moved to, I think, Iowa since then. And that was an amazing experience working with those. I didn't really work directly with the chimps. I worked in the same building with them, and I watched them communicate. They did amazing things. And then I did my PhD at the University of Texas at Austin with David Buss. And then after I did my PhD, I did two postdocs, one on hand washing and one on menopause. And then I ended up at the University of Portsmouth, where I taught psychology, human sexuality, and I also taught about sex differences for a number of years because there wasn't actually not much stuff about that. And it's interesting because we had a first year program where people gave differing views on sex differences. There was one lecture that was quite critical of them, and then my lecture that said they do exist and they are pretty significant and pervasive. And yeah, evolutionary psychology just made a lot of sense to me always. And, when I was an undergraduate at Oglethorpe, there were no evolutionary psychologists. I learned about evolutionary psychology in London. And I brought up evolutionary psychology because I'd read something about it. And my social psychologist professor, she said, those people are idiots. They say that men like to see women in high heels because it's easier to knock them over and inseminate them. And I thought,
well, it depends what town you come from,
amazing.
I suppose.
Yeah. So that's like kind of my very truncated version of the story of how I got into it.
Oh, you might have dropped us in the shit a bit here. Well, I might have dropped us in the shit a bit here because I actually, I read your Wikipedia page and thought, oh, biological science as well. Maybe we can throw a few of those questions in there.
I do know a lot of, I mean, my training is very, very biological because I worked, at this chimp facility. I worked in a clinical facility for a long time. And then my PhD had all to do with women's disgust sensitivity, pregnancy, and immune function. So yeah, my training has been quite biological, and pretty much every evolutionary psychologist. I did take population genetics, and I took like other basic biological courses. So I think almost every evolutionary psychologist I know, despite the claims to the contrary, know a lot about biology. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll see what we get away with today anyway. So that is the premise of today's conversation is sex differences, psychological, biological differences between men and women. Now, if we'd have had this discussion, say 10 years ago, this podcast would have just sort of been, let's sort of explore some interesting differences between men and women. But I think now, especially because of the political climate, the connotations of that question are sort of have shifted, I think. And it's before you get to what are the differences between men and women, we have to first establish whether there are differences at all in the first place. And for me, it seems a bit ridiculous. I think if you ask the average person on the street, are there any differences between men and women? It'd be like, well, duh, of course there is. But then, I mean, I've seen videos of this on YouTube, and it's especially like millennials. If you go and ask them, are there differences between men and women? You can tell that half of them genuinely don't know whether there are or not, and the other half are trying to give the right answer, the pragmatic answer, the answer that's not going to get them in trouble. But a good first question is, how ridiculous is that as a premise? Whether or not there are indeed differences, significant differences between men and women?
There are a lot of books and things out there now that debate the idea that there are sex differences. I have noticed this with my students. So in the first year, because students, especially in the UK, don't tend to speak up, I use a polling system where students get on their phones and then they can answer questions in real time. And then I show them graphs of how they responded. So some 70% of students in the first year agree that there are significant differences between psychological differences between men and women. But in the third year, where I teach psychology of human sexuality, I gave just like a throwaway option on one of the surveys, which was about boys and girls' toys. So I said, if you had a son who was exclusively interested in playing with girls' toys and dressing like a girl, what would you do? And I gave them a bunch of options. And one of the options that I just put in as a throwaway was, there is no difference between girls and boys' toys. And I think like 30% of them endorsed that option. And I was like, I just put that in as a throwaway. I had no idea. And every child will tell you that there's a difference between girls' toys and boys' toys, obviously. But I do think that as they were in school longer, they started to question this more, this kind of very common wisdom. I don't know if 10 years ago, the idea that there were pervasive sex differences was, it seems like every year now there's another book. So I think Cordelia Fine and Gina Rippon, there's another one, I think it's called Pink Brain, Blue Brain, which is about, I think, by a woman named Lisa Eisel. I haven't read that one. I read about half of Gina Rippon's book because I was in some sense debating her, and that'll come out in a couple weeks. But yeah, I think that these conjectures have made it more difficult. And the idea now is that all these data about men and women being different is in some sense because people just want to publish about differences. They don't want to publish about similarities, and that men and women are actually super similar. So that's become, I think, the new narrative. And in the light of the fact that there are still, the wage gap, for example, some people are saying that this is because men and women make different choices. And I think a more feminist position is that no, it's because women are being underpaid or discriminated against in some way. So this position, this narrative that there are no significant psychological sex differences becomes more important in light of things like the wage gap, which have become, much more popular to talk about in recent years.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you know much about the sort of history of it. So for me, it seems that in psychology and neuroscience in particular, it would have sort of, it would have always been a topic that was up for discussion, whereas it's only very recently that it's become such a heated topic amongst lay people, amongst the general public. And I'm just wondering if you know about any of the history of either of those, and then how they sort of came to intertwine so sort of intensely in more recent years.
I actually don't know what's happened in the last decade. Certainly people like, Christine Hoff Sommers and other feminist thinkers. Back when I was in graduate school, which was about 10 years ago, we talked a lot about Darwinian feminism, about people like, Marianne Fisher and Marty Hazelton, and evolutionary psychology women like Leda Cosmides, who talked about how that there were differences between men and women, but they still approached women's issues from a feminist position. So even back then, there was this tension between kind of third wave feminists and what we perceived as Darwinian or biological realist kind of feminists. But no, the history, I don't know. And I don't know why it's become such a popular and contentious issue, other than potentially because the wage gap doesn't seem to be going away, even though there's been a lot of legislation and other ways that people have tried to approach closing it. It doesn't actually seem to be going away.
Okay, well, maybe sort of bring this a bit closer to home. And you're mentioning these sort of feminist issues. So I'm going to read you a quote here. And it's, men are better at reading maps and engineering, and women are better at reading facial expressions and are more interested in social problems. Now, everyone, that's not Archie Bunker or Roy Chubby Brown. That's you. That's Diana Fleischman saying that. And you see, that's the sort of thing that I don't feel like I could get away with making that sort of assertion. And you think of yourself as a feminist. I've read that. That I know that's on Wikipedia, but I've definitely read that on an actual article that you participated in.
Yeah.
But again, a statement like that, and some of the other opinions that you hold, sort of run contrary to the prevailing orthodoxy, I guess would be the best way to put it. So how do you square that circle of being a feminist, but saying, well, something like that? There are definitely differences between men and women that are significant.
I think that the position of feminism is just that men and women should be afforded the same opportunities, and that women should be, there are some places in the world where women can't own property or be involved in political discussions if they choose to, as much as men can. So I think the position of feminism certainly is, I mean, some people would say that that's actually not what feminism is about anymore. The definition of feminism is a very contentious issue. So people like Christine Hoff Sommers have said we need to reclaim the label of feminism. But for me, yes, feminism is essentially about giving women opportunities to do what they choose to do, and then also giving them things, freedoms that would enable them to do things that are feminine. So women tend to be more interested in spending time with their family and having children. And I think that women have a higher prevalence of depression than men do, although they have a lower prevalence of suicide. And it's unclear to me if what women are doing now, which is participating in the labor force at greater rates, is actually what it means. So if you, there's a study that I talk about a lot in my presentations about sex differences, which is a study of very mathematically gifted men and women. This was over 1,700 participants, and they all were in the top 1% of mathematical giftedness. And they asked men and women, how much time would you like to spend at your ideal job? And men said, 30% of men said over 40 hours a week, and 7% of women said over 40 hours a week that they would like to spend at their ideal job. And when you ask them what they thought was important, women tended to say that they think spending time with family is more important, or doing something that's good for the world is more important. And in places like Scandinavia, where women are given a lot more maternity leave, childcare, they're given a lot more options about how they are going to take care of their families. Women actually tend to choose even more to spend time with their children and their families than they do in other places like in the US, where women are afforded less of these kinds of opportunities. So I'm just going to go out on a limb and say perhaps women are actually, on average, would be happier to have these kinds of choices. But it does seem like the more choice you give women, the greater these gaps become. And so for me, I just think it's about giving people the options that can make them happiest, even if those options fit squarely in sex roles that people think are illegitimate. So when I post about this, when women choosing to work a few hours than men at their ideal job, or women saying that it's more important for them to spend time with family, people will still say, oh, well, maybe women think that if they don't spend time with their family, their children won't get cared for like they want them to, or any number of other things. I'm in the camp with, there's this guy called Brian Kaplan who wrote a book called Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. And he says that people really hover over their children way more than they should. Most of what actually how your children turn out is genetic, and you could put them in daycare. You don't have to force them to practice piano 10 hours a week or whatever it is that you're interested in. If kids are really interested in something, you can encourage them, but it doesn't really make sense to be like a tiger mother or to really hothouse them in the way that people are doing. And I think that's a really important message for women, because it might make them feel like they need to spend less time with their kids. But it does seem like women are still choosing more family related kinds of priorities. And, I'm saying this as a woman who has no children. I'm about to get married, but I don't have any firsthand experience with this. I'm just saying on average, it seems like men and women have different priorities.
Right. Okay. Well, we're going to get into issues like averages and the socialization, things like that. Before we jump into it, and I'm going to sort of split this conversation into two really, and it's the biological arguments and then the psychological ones. But before, I don't know if I'm just going to sort of pick on you with this one, or whether this is something that I should sort of have it out with everybody at the beginning of every interview. One of the reasons I've had to sort of disconnect from the mental health industry is over the years I'm not an academic or anything. I've got no bleeding qualifications or anything, thick as shit. But I've learned to critique the methodology of mental health research, and it's shite. In general, it's shocking. And in doing the research for this conversation, I've come across a bit of a dichotomy, I guess, really. And that's sort of wondering, because you're going to present evidence to us, research that you've either read or engaged in, that back your arguments up. But in doing the research for this, so Gina Rippon in the Gendered Brain, she is consistently critical of the methodology of various studies, particularly when it's studies that show that, you know, women are inferior or men are superior in some form or other. But then in his review of her book on Quillette, so Larry Cahill, I think he's called, he's a professor of neurobiology. He said, a book like this is very difficult for someone knowledgeable about the field to review seriously. It's so chock full of bias that one keeps wondering why one is bothering with it at all. Now, he classing himself as someone knowledgeable in the field, but Gina Rippon herself, she's a cognitive neuroscientist. And then, you know, there's other reviews saying, you know, Gina Rippon destroys neurosexism and, you know, like BuzzFeed and all them shits. But then more sort of down the middle, the Financial Times, that's sort of an unbiased, high-quality news source. Even their review of it said it's a clever study into flawed research and gender-based misconceptions of the mind. And so your average person that's trying to pass out the truth from these debates, what are they to do with that? Cognitive neuroscientists on one side saying, you're talking bollocks, and then the person on the other side saying, no, you're talking bollocks. But each argument to the average person is sort of equally strong. And so then when we sit down and have this conversation, I have to say to you, well, you know, what makes your argument, valid or stronger than the one that you're coming up against?
Okay. I would just put in another plug for a very critical review of Gina Rippon's book by Saloni Datani. Her Twitter handle is Salonium, and she read the whole thing cover to cover. I salute her because I actually couldn't finish this book.
Yeah, it's not the best, is it?
It's, I mean, so Gina Rippon, I think that there's some areas of criticism where she's really has some validity, right? So I think that one area of criticism that she makes is about functional magnetic resonance imaging, and about how that's actually not a very sensitive tool for figuring out what's actually happening in the brain. But then later in the book, when it suits her, she uses that evidence to bolster her claims. In the beginning of the book, she talks a little bit about animal research, but she kind of dismisses it in a way that I couldn't actually pin down. So she really dismisses looking at animals as instructive in looking at humans, and it's unclear why.
Yeah,
and then
Larry Cahill pointed that same criticism out, that she was very dismissive of the animal studies.
Yeah, and so I don't really, most of the time when I'm having arguments or debates with people and they dismiss animal research out of hand, they're arguing from a position of human exceptionalism. And that I don't think is a very scientific starting point for any kind of debate.
Well, actually, let's just stop there on that. Are they arguing for human exceptionalism, or are they arguing for the fact that there's just so much differentiation between the species that it's a valid point to make that, you know, what the elders studying, I don't know, beavers have to do with, you know, with human interaction or human neuroscience?
I didn't see any beaver studies, actually.
There wasn't any beavers. There was some sort of vole in there or something, but I couldn't remember what it was.
Studies, yeah. The vole studies are really cool. Yes, I would say that you could argue that they are different, and you could say, let's restrict even if somebody said, I don't actually agree with talking about mammals generally, you can only talk about great apes, then that would still give people who are talking about sex differences a lot of ammunition. So when they say you can't talk about non-human animals full stop, that makes it quite difficult. So Cordelia Fine actually does this in, I think, a more subtle and slick way than Gina Rippon does. So Cordelia Fine does obviously give more weight to those studies that support her conjectures than those that do not. She's much more critical of studies that don't support her than she is of studies that do support her. Gina Rippon does the same thing, but it's more transparent because she goes from criticizing fMRI to embracing fMRI. And then she also talks a lot about the differences in brain structures. So one of the points that she makes, I don't remember if she makes this in the actual book or if this is a quote that she made around, but saying that there is no structure or pattern in the brain. I tweeted this actually, that is male or female, but you can tell if a brain is male or female with something like 80% accuracy by just looking at the structure. But you need like a computational model, right? It's about the average sizes of all these different structures put together, and it's not like about the size of any one particular structure. But at the same time, I don't think brains tell us that much because our resolution, as in our ability to figure out what's going on from brains, isn't so great. So if I showed you a mass murderer's brain and I showed you a professor of physics who never even got a speeding ticket's brain, I don't know if you'd be able to tell those two apart with greater accuracy than chance. And yet that doesn't actually mean that those two are not any different from each other, right?
Right. Okay, let's jump in now with and start going through some of these points. So starting right from the base biological perspective. Now, one of the arguments that you see, especially you see conservatives use this argument a lot. I speak as a conservative, by the way, but I do think that this is a bit of a reductive one that gets thrown out, and it's it's XX chromosomes versus XY chromosomes, ergo different, done, end of story. No?
It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. No, that was a different argument. Yes, it's true. So like intersex people are really, really rare. When people talk about gender being a spectrum, yes, maybe like gender representation is a spectrum, but sex is not necessarily I think sex, when people talk about the gender binary, male and female are the categories that encompass something like 99.7% of people, right? So there are some unusual cases of people who are either intersex or they have other kinds of what you would call disorders of sexual development. So one of the most famous ones is something called androgen insensitivity syndrome, and it's not super common. And Jamie Lee Curtis was said to have this. I don't know 100% if she had it or not, but these are men who are XY, right? So they are XY, but they're totally immune to testosterone. So the default sex of human development is female. So if you have no testosterone receptors at all in your body, you will develop as a female. And they have a totally outward feminine appearance. They tend to actually be very tall and beautiful and have big breasts and not have any body hair. So they often are models. But instead of inside of their body cavity, instead of two ovaries, they actually have undescended testicles. So they just never actually did come out as they never get periods. They're infertile, for example. And so this is quite a rare thing. But this is one example of somebody that you would say is a woman, looks as a woman to everybody, has all the woman's secondary sexual characteristics, but doesn't have the primary sexual characteristics, doesn't have ovaries, and doesn't have menstruation and can't get pregnant. So this is like one of these odd, I say odd because this is an exceedingly rare condition. But I wouldn't say that there's no sex binary, because for the same reason that I wouldn't say, people, tend to have two hands. Some people are like missing one finger. Some people are missing one hand. That doesn't mean like having hands is on a spectrum. That just means that like there are some people without hands, right? And the same thing I think with sex. So, conservatives do talk about this. The other way that you can think about it is that in all species, the organism with the large gametes, so egg cells are the largest cells in the human body, they're the females, and the organism with the sex with the smaller gametes is the male. And in our species, sperm cells are the smallest cells in the human body. So that's another way that you can distinguish between male and female. There are no animals, nothing in the kingdom Animalia that has an intermediate gamete size. They either have big gametes or small gametes, or sometimes both gametes. They're all obviously hermaphrodites. Whereas there's like a fungus that has like 30 sexes or something. But there's a lot of reasons why we develop two sexes. It's a lot easier to hook up if you use two sexes as compared to like 30 sexes, just biologically. So the idea that there is no gender binary or there is no sex binary is super popular right now, but it, biologically there just is. Most people fall into one of the two camps.
Right. Okay. Now, so these questions are going to be based on not Cordelia Fine, who we're thinking of now. Who was the other one? Gina Rippon.
Rippon, yeah.
Yeah. So this idea of a gendered brain, which is quite consequential, I suppose. Again, especially from a political perspective, it seems to be sort of the thread running through it at the moment. So structural differences in brains. The way the brain looks under the microscope, or the fMRI, if you like.
fMRI, yeah.
Yeah. So, before we get into the psychology, I want to sort of focus on this purely the structural perspective. So again, here we go. Gina Rippon. Alleged sex-gender differences in brain structures such as the amygdala or hippocampus, or the ratio of brain cells to brain pathways, disappear or become trivial once corrections for brain size or volume are made. Then, this is about Larry Cahill. This is a Stanford University article writing about him, about his research. Adjusted for total brain size, men's are bigger. A woman's hippocampus, critical to learning and memorization, is larger than a man's and works differently. Conversely, a man's amygdala, associated with the experiencing of emotions and the recollection of such experiences, is bigger than a woman's. So again, completely different views there. More confusing because this isn't... the brain scans are right there to compare these sizes. So I'm confused why there's confusion there. So I'm just wondering what your take is on this, where you fall on that debate. Who's right and to what extent does it matter?
So Stuart Ritchie's got a review with like a ton of co-authors about the differences between brains in a scan, and looking at different structures in thousands of participants, and the averages, and also controlling for overall brain size, and I think also maybe controlling for body size. To be perfectly honest, I'm not an expert on differences in men and women's brains, and I've never bothered really reading too much into it for these reasons. As I said, it doesn't seem right now that we actually can tell very much from looking at somebody's brain about what they're like. So you can tell if somebody has Alzheimer's or if somebody has encephaly, right? But you can't really tell much else about personality or even mental illness just looking at kind of brain scans. Nor can you tell looking in an fMRI machine that much about what somebody is doing or thinking, other than that they're listening to something, or that they're seeing something, or that they're being disgusted. Those are all things that you can tell at kind of an above chance rate. So similar to, there's some research looking at like circulating estrogen levels or circulating testosterone levels. Men have more testosterone than women do, but unfortunately, you also have to think about testosterone receptors. So in that case of androgen sensitivity syndrome, these people just don't have androgen receptors. So it doesn't actually matter what their circulating testosterone is. Don't have the receptors to actually have any psychological cascade or physiological cascade with it. And I think something similar about brains is that you might be able to say that some brain area is bigger or smaller, but the kind of more granular things that you might not be able to tell. So how connected are, how much white matter is there? How many glia are there? How many neurons? How densely packed are they? How big is the cortex? There's some evidence that women's cortex is bigger, whereas men's overall brain size is bigger, for example. So I don't actually pay attention to these squabbles very much, because it just seems much more straightforward to me to look at men's and women's actual behavior, their actual choices, the way that they actually fill out psychological surveys. I mean, some of this is obviously self-report, but all of those things seem much more important for real world effects than, brain size, which may or may not actually be indicative of anything pervasive.
So, well, I mean, speaking of sticking with sort of physical differences, I mean, this is purely sort of a speculative question that I haven't really formulated it properly myself, to be honest, but I'm wondering if you know anything about the sort of, beyond the obvious physical differences between men and women, how the physical differences that do exist between the two sort of exact consequence in the real world, like to sort of be a woman embodied or a man embodied, what that means and to what extent that that affects a person's experience in the world. Does that make sense?
But it does make sense, yeah. So, I mean, there was a really great study. There's a guy called Aaron Lukashevitz. I think that's how his name is pronounced. It's one of those names with many consonants. But he was looking at men and women and extroversion. And extroversion is kind of a risky strategy because you're going up to strangers and you're talking more than, you could potentially get in trouble with things that you say. You're socializing. And extroversion is predicted in men by their androgen receptors. So as I said before, androgen receptors are as important as the hormones themselves. They're predicted by men's physical strength, and they're also predicted by attractiveness. Whereas in women, extroversion is predicted by attractiveness, but not by physical strength. So it seems that there are physical characteristics that are more important for men versus women in terms of determining their personality. There's also been studies showing that men's upper body strength and hand grip strength is a predictor of their attitudes towards distributing wealth, like socialism, for example, because the story goes that larger men would not have tolerated scrounging because they could have beat other men up. So there's a physicality difference that's very different between men and women. And I talk about this. I'm writing about how men and women actually interact with each other in terms of rewards and punishments. And if a man throughout evolutionary history wanted to control another person's behavior, if he was big enough, he always had a very simple solution. He would either beat somebody up or threaten to beat them up, right? Whereas women would have had to use more sophisticated methods because it's not very common for a woman to be able to actually just threaten with force someone other than like children or smaller women, right? So if a woman wanted something from a man, force wouldn't have been able to be something that she would have been able to use on average, right? And so these are the differences between men and women. I'm just reminded of one other thing. In the book Mate, written by my fiance, Jeffrey Miller, he talks about how men don't really understand what going through the world like a woman is like. And he said, imagine that you were in a bar full of 7-foot tall gay NFL linebackers, right? And they all really want to have sex with you.
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't that be really scary? And I'm 5 feet tall. Like, I'm a tiny person. I don't feel afraid at all in the world, like going through the world. And I very rarely ever have. But I know that I'm unusual in this respect, and that women are actually somewhat sensitive to, how many large men there are around and the difference, the dimorphism between them. And so it does seem like an instructive kind of thought experiment for men to take. It's like, what would it be like to go through the world if you were tiny and everybody wanted to have sex with you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of, even if, whether or not you feel intimidated in that sort of environment, it's sort of irrelevant, isn't it? Because you still are just inherently more vulnerable in that sort of situation.
And Dave Chappelle makes a similar case. I don't know if I can curse on your podcast.
Of course.
I can, good. So Dave Chappelle talks about how he did like a gig for some, I don't know, drug dealers or mafia or something. And they gave him $25,000 in cash. And he was walking through the ghetto with $25,000 in cash in his backpack. And he was thinking constantly about getting jumped or about what somebody would do to get that $25,000 from him. And he said, this is like what it's like to have a pussy. When you have a pussy, you always have something on you that everybody wants. And that's like having 25 grand in your backpack.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. I do wonder what that's like, having that sort of power that women have, just inherent in being a woman.
I mean, I think people don't talk about this enough, but we were talking last night. I was talking with some other Darwinian people, and this guy was saying, the first time I went to a gay bar, it was like amazing because I've never gotten so much attention, and it was a really strange experience. And I said, yeah, the first time I went to a gay bar, I was really distressed because I got so little attention.
Yeah, you know what? I remember back in my days working for the escort agencies, and especially, I mean, in general, I'm not saying it like that. In general,
yeah,
escorts tend to be sort of average attractiveness, like no more attractive than women in the general population.
Oh, that's surprising.
Yeah.
Well, they know more about how to doll themselves up, though. They have a better sense of that, I guess, on average.
Yeah, they learn it. But there are, again, well, I suppose with any population, there's the outliers, there's the really sort of stunning, amazingly beautiful women. And, as part of my job was to sort of look after those girls, keep them occupied, make sure they behave themselves. And I remember sometimes the nights where not many jobs were coming in, and we'd sort of go to one of the clubs or whatever around Manchester. And just with those girls that were particularly attractive, just seeing the way an entire room would react to very beautiful women, and also the way that the men would react towards me, it was almost like strangely the attention from the men was sort of divided. With the women, it was sort of either looks of like in awe or sort of jealous of the girl, and the men, it was like, oh my God, she's fucking amazing, and I'm gonna have to beat his ass to get to her, sort of thing, because they assumed that I was with her. But
boyfriend,
yeah, but at the same time, I've worked with guys that were like with gay escorts as well, that were like super amazingly good looking guys. But yeah,
they don't get as much attention.
No.
Even
women just don't seem that enamored by it. It's interesting.
And a beautiful woman is a draw for the eyes of everybody. Women too. Women look admiringly at other women all the time. Yeah, or enviously, as the case may be. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Let's move on, because I can go down the escorting rabbit hole
and
never come out of it. Yeah. Okay. Let's get into your speciality and the psychology of it. So what the brain actually puts out, and the brain sort of interaction with the world, I guess. So let's sort of coming back to this old trope here of women's brains sort of wired for empathy and intuition, and men's brains are wired for reason and action. Would you agree with that statement in general?
So recently I did a review, a paper. The paper is out. It's a very large scale report about how well women can perceive facial expressions. So we know that with different measures, and this is kind of getting into the weeds a bit, so I won't dwell on here too much. But when it comes to Simon Baron-Cohen's mind in the eyes task, that mind in the eyes task, women tend to do better than men do. And that's being able to tell what facial expression people are making based on just their eyes. But if you ever look at the mind in the eyes task, the words that are on there are things like contemptuous, or there's some very big 75-cent words in there. I think that women are also potentially have a better vocabulary for describing their own emotions. And that might be another reason why women do better on that particular task. A paper that I reviewed, this guy, Lewis, I think, he did a paper with his graduate students, and they were looking at how well men and women can perceive facial expressions, and they showed them for a very short period of time, but also bodily expressions of emotion. And so women tended to be somewhat better at recognizing facial expressions, but not bodily expressions. Men were slightly better at recognizing bodily expressions. So there is this kind of hashing of this particular idea that women are better at recognizing facial expressions. So it seems like with the mind and the eyes, women are better at recognizing facial expressions with less data. But with the facial expression study that I looked at, it looked like women were only better than men consistently at detecting a facial expression of disgust compared to all other facial expressions, which is partly why I reviewed the paper, because my specialty is looking at disgust sensitivity. So it does seem that women are more interested in people versus things, that women are somewhat better at recognizing facial expressions from very little information. But it does seem that there is an interesting exception to this, in that men, are good at recognizing bodily expressions of emotion.
So what would be, well, before I jump into that, I'm interested in why, have you got any sort of hypothesis on why that's the case? Why women faces men body language?
I think it has something to do, if I'm speculating wildly, and not that wildly, it probably makes a lot of sense, but if I'm speculating, I would say it's because children, their bodily expressions are not as indicative as their facial expressions, because their bodies are smaller, right? They can have a tantrum or whatever, but their faces are very expressive, and their faces, especially when they're pre-verbal, are the ways that they communicate with their mothers about what they want, whether they're sad or happy, right? And so to me, it makes sense, because women have been responsible for most of the childcare. They'd be more sensitive to facial expressions. But that's just kind of like my story. I think that men also might be more sensitive to bodily expressions because men were at more risk for being physically assaulted.
Yeah, aggression.
And so a body is more indicative of whether or not you're going to be physically assaulted. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I think what I'm most interested in here is examples of where men's and women's psychology are sort of the most different, because there's all sorts of, whatever aspects of psychology or life or, jobs, hobbies, whatever you pick, there seems to be some sort of either linguistic or philosophical way to wriggle out of arguing that the differences exist there. And so I'm just wondering what for you, like a couple of examples of the most stark differences between men and women. And I'm going to say, feel free to slip some sex in there, because again, I know. Sorry, but I remember on one of the slides that you sent me, you said that it I know it'll boost ratings and everything, but isn't it the differences in sexuality that do tend to be the most stark as well?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So the largest sex differences there are in a couple of different domains. An evolutionary psychologist would say you should expect to see the largest sex differences in those domains in which there have been the strongest selection pressures, which means that those domains in which it made the biggest difference to men and women's reproductive success, whether or not they were good or motivated in that particular domain. And so there's a couple of domains in which there are the biggest sex differences. One of those domains is in throwing accuracy and like upper body strength. So men have much better throwing accuracy than women do. The D value on that, I can't remember. It's like, that's the difference between the means. But in order to just kind of put it in layman's terms, 99% of men have better throwing accuracy.
Wow.
And they can throw harder than the average woman. So there's a huge difference in this particular domain. And it's actually even bigger than the difference in height. So some, 90% of women are tall. I mean, if men are taller than the average woman, there's very few women that are, over 6 feet tall compared to men. And this difference is even bigger than that one. So that's one domain where you see very big difference. The other domain is in sexuality. So the vast majority of women are attracted to men. The vast majority of men are attracted to women. That's a sex difference, right? Who you're attracted to is a major sex difference. But the other major sex difference is in comfort with casual sex or motivation to have casual sex. So my advisor, David Buss, did some investigation of how long you would have to know somebody in order to have sex with them. And they asked men and women this question. So I'll just get back to like the biological reason for this, because people forget about this. Let's say you have a woman and she has sex with 50 men in a year, or you have a man and he has sex with 50 women in a year. Who is going to have more babies?
The man.
That's right.
Yeah.
So for a woman, it doesn't matter how many men she has sex with. I do think that sex isn't just for reproduction. People have sex to affiliate. I think that's a major evolutionary pressure on sexuality. I think women also have sex in order to acquire resources. You see this in all kinds of cultures, because you're talking about escorts. For example, you see this in non-human animals as well, where females sometimes exchange sex for protection or for resources. But
you see that in animals?
Yeah, there's like a baboon study that shows that there are female baboons who have like special friends, and they sometimes mate with them, and then that male is more likely to protect them against other males.
Wow. Okay.
So those are the kinds of things, and I did studies on this as well. I did a study that showed that some 25% of undergrads that I was looking at, they said that they had a friend that they got free meals from or dinners from or whatever, and that they knew that person wanted to have sex with them, whether or not they were ever going to have sex with them. So women do, I think, it's not a Machiavellian thing. I think that women consciously use their sex appeal and their attractiveness to get things from people. I don't think this is kind of newsflash to anybody, right? So in terms of sexuality, there's mate choice, and then there's also how willing they are to have sex. So one difference that I've investigated a lot is sexual disgust. Women tend to be much more sexually disgusted than men are on average. And women also tend to be more disgusted by things like pornography than men are. And also in the sexual domain, if you look at like sexual morals, women tend to be more moralistic about sex than men are on average. So if you ask, there's a really interesting battery of questions from my colleague, Josh Tiber. If you ask women, how disgusted would you be to hear people having sex next door? Women tend to say that they'd be more disgusted by that than men are. And in the studies that I've done myself, I've shown that women who are sexually aroused, so there's some literature, like 5 studies or so, that show that men who are sexually aroused become less disgust sensitive, especially when it comes to sexual stuff. Whereas it doesn't actually seem that happens to women. Women who are sexually aroused, there's some evidence, but not great evidence, that they become less disgust sensitive. So there's a variety of reasons for this. So I just talked about how, a man who has sex with 50 women could potentially have 50 kids. A woman who has sex with 50 men can still only have 1 kid. But there's also a big difference in terms of disease risk with sex between men and women. So we don't know how long sexually transmitted infections have been around, but women are much more likely to get sexually transmitted infections than men are. And there's no delicate way of putting this, but because women they have a pocket, right? And men don't. Men have external genitals, women have internal genitals. And so if you look at something like chlamydia, women are 3 times as likely to contract it if you have sex with somebody who's HIV positive one time. So if you're the woman having sex with a man who's HIV positive, there's a 1 in 1,500 chance that you will contract HIV. If you're a man having sex with a woman who's HIV positive, you have a 1 in 2,500 chance of contracting HIV. So it's a much, much smaller risk because the genitals are external. And so they just don't stay wet as long. It's just like mechanics, right? So forever, women have been more likely to more likely to get pregnant, which is a huge burden if they didn't choose their mate carefully, but also much more likely to get infections from sex than men have, which is another reason why we might expect women to be more disgust sensitive in the sexual domain than men are, because sex is much riskier, not only because of reproduction, but also because of sexually transmitted infections. So the studies that have been done on men and women have shown that a woman would have to know a man, I think, for 3 months to say that she would be as likely to have sex with him as a man would be after knowing a woman for 1 day. There's a famous study done by this couple of experimenters called Clark and Hatfield. The story goes that they didn't actually get IRB approval for it. They did it anyway, and then it became famous, and then they got retroactively were okay. But they had men. So in psychological studies, if you have a person who works for you, who goes up to people pretending to be a normal person, you don't know that they're actually an experimenter. That's called a confederate, right? So they had a man go up to a confederate, male confederate, handsome guy, go up to women on the street, and they were randomized to ask the woman one of 3 questions. Would you like to go on a date with me? Or to a different woman, would you like to go back to my apartment with me, or would you like to have sex with me? Right. And then they had an attractive woman go up to men on the street and say, would you like to go on a date with me? Or would you like to go back to my apartment? Or would you like to have sex with me? 75% of men said yes to sex with a strange woman who just approached them on the street. 0% of women said yes to a stranger approaching them on the street and asking them to have sex. This was in the 90s. And some people have tried to say like, oh, you know, if you look at, if you control for a bunch of factors, you can get women to say yes at a slightly higher rate. So if you tell women you won't be slut shamed and this guy is not dangerous, I think those are the two main ones. They say yes at a slightly higher rate. But I just want to say that the men who said yes to the woman who wanted to have sex with them, they had no assurance that there wasn't a man in that woman's house who would beat the shit out of them. So the men were also taking a risk, even though it's not the same risk that we normally think about. And news that you can use is that if you're a man who goes up to a woman randomly on the street and asks her if she wants like to go on a date, 50% of women said yes.
50%
of women said yes to a date.
Yeah, but but this is, what was this, a handsome Confederate?
I think it was a handsome Confederate. That's right.
Yeah, well, another tip would be, I think it's easier. I had a mate years ago who was very good at chatting up women, and he would always have a wing woman with him to approach women, because he said, I don't know if this is right, but he said that it was sort of confirmation to the woman that he was already safe. He'd been sort of pre-approved by this other woman. So yeah, there you go.
I was out with my friend in New York the other day, and he got a woman's phone number, and it was sweet of him to say this. I'm not sure, but he's like, it's because you were with me. You were like social proof that I'm safe and that I'm, you know, that a woman would spend time with me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it. That's the exact term he used, social proofing. Yeah.
That's right, social proof.
Right. You see, the thing with the sexuality stuff is, it seems it's hard. It's sort of very hard to dispute it from a socialization perspective. And that's one of the big arguments about gender, is whether it's nurture versus nature. And so I think a good area for us to get into now to tackle that issue, this idea of it's socialization which creates the differences between genders, would maybe be maybe work choices or something. Or I don't know if I've got a better example with a more that produces more distinct differences. But I was thinking maybe the workplace or something like that. Workplace environment.
Workplace, like occupational interests, is interesting, and we almost certainly will get to that. But another really big domain of difference between men and women is mate choice. So men tend to prioritize physical attractiveness. They want somebody who's generally younger than they are. And women tend to prioritize status and tend to want somebody.
Okay, yeah. Let me stop you there and allow you to sort of extrapolate that in a bit more detail, because I think there's definitely some socialization arguments to be made there. I'll try and play devil's advocate a little bit with that. But if you'd like to, yeah,
good luck.
yeah, and I'll try. I mean, it's even harder because I think it's all bollocks, but we'll see.
Let me just tell you guys, like you in the audience, what I think is a really kind of, so there's, I think 3 or 4, I vacillate on which kind of home run kind of examples that I think show how these kinds of processes are not socialized. So one major one. So the perfect experiment that you would do if you wanted to find out if these differences are socialized or not would be to raise somebody as a girl who's actually a boy, and it would be just unambiguous that they were a girl. So there was a study, not really a study, it was kind of a case study. So back in I think it was like 70s or 80s, there was a boy who had a botched circumcision. They tried to raise him as a girl. They gave him female hormones. And this is called the Bruce Brenda case. This is a guy who ended up changing his name to David, as in David and Goliath, because he felt like the medical establishment had screwed him over so badly. But so David Reimer is one example of this. But there's a much better example of this in the Dominican Republic. Some 1% of boys are born with female genitals, or what looks exactly like female genitals. And they're called hueva doces, which means eggs at 12. So huevos doces, which means that their testicles don't drop until they're 12 years old.
Okay.
So they actually don't have any external genitals. So some of these boys, their genitals, it looks like they have labia, but there's actually like little tiny testes in their labia. And they get given girls' names and they get raised as girls until they're 12. And then their genitals, because they're immune to the form of testosterone that would usually masculinize you early on. But the second kind of testosterone that happens at puberty, they're not immune to. So they only develop masculine characteristics when they're 12 years old. These boys raised entirely as girls. There's actually a really great, I think it's on Vimeo, this clip of them that you can look up if you want to. A little boy whose name was Catherine until he was 12 years old. And then he gets a haircut. He gets dressed up like a boy for the first time in his life. And there's one study about 19 of these. They all become heterosexual men.
Well, I mean, I suppose you could argue that with that one, it would be that it's that cultural process that's caused that it's the culture purposefully treats them like girls for the first 12 years and then flips when they hit 12 and then they start to live as boys. And so, maybe you could argue that's really got nothing to do with this onslaught of testosterone. I'm trying. You know what? It's about the quality of argument you're going to get from BuzzFeed or something like that. So,
yeah, I mean, I think one argument you could make if I was going to really steel man this argument for socialization would be like, oh, in the Dominican Republic, it's like a really macho kind of culture. And maybe if you gave any girl the opportunity to be a boy, she would take it because there's a patriarchy there and men have more power. And so if suddenly, I was to grow balls, I would be like, okay, cool. It's going to be totally seamless for me to adopt a masculine identity because men have more power and I would prefer to have a masculine identity. Okay. So that's one example of why I think socialization is not as important as biologically determined hormones and genetics. Okay. The other example is in the case of girls who have something called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And the short version of this is that their adrenal glands produce testosterone. So they have androgens and they are androgenized in the womb. So they often have like, somewhat masculinized looking genitals. And then they also but they're raised as girls. And sometimes they have sisters who are unaffected by this disorder. And in one study, they looked at their toy preferences and they looked at their other kinds of preferences. And they found, so like at the end of the study with these girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia and their sisters, they said, you can pick whatever toy you want to take home as a gift for being in the study. And 48% of the girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia chose a toy car to take home. And 0% of the girls without decided to take that toy home. And 28% of girls without congenital adrenal hyperplasia took a doll home. Only 7% of girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And these girls tend to have more masculinized interests. They tend to be more likely to go into typically masculine jobs, things like engineering, although there is some mixed evidence about whether or not they're more likely to be bisexual or whether or not they're more likely to have good spatial rotation skills. So I don't know if the jury's in on that, but that's another really good example where even if two girls are raised in the same home, they're both girls, the one with congenital adrenal hyperplasia will be more masculinized in her interests and her toy preferences and also in the way that she plays with other kids.
But do these girls sort of present more masculine as well, like facially or physically in any other way? Are they bigger? Are they, look more like boys?
Yeah, they are a little bit more masculine looking. So that absolutely could be, I think, a possible confound. I don't know if they rated them on like how feminine or masculine looking they were.
Because I just suppose from that perspective, you could argue that, you could almost maybe be inadvertently socialized as boys because not even that it's like, she looks like a boy, let's treat her like a boy, but just from sort of what we've been talking about in the first place, just the sort of an unconscious reaction to a more masculine face makes the parents and the adults treat them differently. I don't know if that's is that a better argument than the last one?
That's a good steel man. I think that's a good steel man. By the way, steel manning is the opposite of straw manning. So it's when you try to make your opponent's argument as strong as possible for those people who have never heard of it before. I think. If I'm going to argue against that, I think it would be pretty wild if we had very complex socialization repertoires such that if somebody looked more masculine, we told them they were slightly better at math, versus if they looked slightly more feminine, we told them that they should play with dolls and things like that. But there are pretty pervasive influences of things like attractiveness and also neoteny. So like how childlike your face is versus how mature your face is. There's studies that have shown that if you're more neotenous, so I'm fairly neotenous looking, I have a very round face, I have big eyes, right? People who have neotenous faces are less likely to be given responsibility, and they're also more likely to be like acquitted for crimes, right? So those are the kinds of social effects that you might see have pervasive effects on personality. Even if so there's this thing that people say, which is physiognomy is real. You can actually tell a lot about somebody just looking at their face. And it's unclear how much of that is because of socialization or how much of that is because of there's actually genes linked to the physical characteristics. So maybe having a baby face is actually correlated with being less competent or less likely to do crimes, right? So that's another reason why that the case may be. But that's one, I think, legitimate objection that people make to things like twin studies is they say, okay, twins are super, super similar, but they might be super similar because people socialize the same face in a similar way. So however handsome you are, mature, childlike, whatever you look like, might actually have a pretty pervasive influence on how people end up treating you. And so then the only, I think, pure experiments you could get would be twins for whatever reason who have very different faces, but still are the same in every other way and same identical genetically. Yeah.
I suppose another one, which is, just as I'm trying to concoct it here, feels very weak, but I'll throw it out there anyway, is you mentioned these girls choosing a car, a masculine toy over a traditionally more feminine toy. Who's to say that a car is necessarily a masculine toy?
People do say that's. So there's another study, what I think is kind of home run kind of study is of monkeys' preferences. So monkeys don't spend a lot of time, like watching television or being socialized like humans, but male monkeys have a strong preference for toy cars over plush toys. And the female monkeys don't have as strong a preference. So the female monkeys show pretty similar interest, but male monkeys do show a much stronger interest in toy cars. Exactly. Why is that a masculine toy? How does that get back to kind of our evolutionary history? People would say that play is in the service of folk physics, and rough and tumble play has a lot to do with folk physics. So that might be the kind of argument that you would make. Certainly folk physics is really important for men to learn if you do believe that men have been always more likely to do hunting as compared to gathering. One argument that people don't know about this is that because the color vision gene is on the sex chromosome, men don't have a backup copy of their color vision gene. So the Y chromosome isn't so much as a Y chromosome as it is like a shriveled up, weird little X chromosome that doesn't actually develop an extra leg. Like a Y chromosome is kind of a misshapen little X chromosome. And so women have two copies of color vision genes. If they have one that doesn't work, they have a backup, whereas men do not. And so that's why some 8% of men are colorblind. I think it's 8%. Compared to women. And that's another reason why you might say there was a specialization of labor, because you need color vision to collect, to gather. Like that's pretty important to be able to figure out what's edible and what's not based on color.
Yeah, I suppose, I just, a more simple explanation, which occurred to me as I was concocting the question, which is why it was weak, is the car and the doll just fall back very much on the general idea of women preferring, engaging with people and being more empathetic versus, men. A car is clearly a thing. It hasn't got a face. It's not got eyes. It's not got anything to sort of recognize and empathize with. I guess. So,
and you occasionally hear stories about like little girls taking a toy car and treating it like a baby, like playing with it like, like an infant, or making things that are ambiguous into the toys that they would nurture. I did actually happen to see this this friend of mine's baby, I think she was like 8 months old, interact for the first time with a baby doll. And the first time she ever saw a baby doll, she was just overcome. She was so excited. I've never seen anything like it. So yeah, have you got a son and a daughter, or?
I have. Well, I was just going to bring this up now. This is sort of a common thing that happens with these sorts of conversations, is the sort of the exception to the rule, where I could say, girls tend to play with dolls or whatever. My little girl, she's 2.5. She loves playing with cars, and
cool.
and a granddad, he's a tool man, a workman, and he's got a shed and spanners and screwdrivers and stuff all over the place, and she likes to play with that sort of thing, and everyone's always saying, oh, she's going to be an engineer when she's older. And people often use those examples as a counter to in these sorts of discussions. And I don't know whether this is a question about dealing with that sort of thing interpersonally, more than as a sort of a serious research or study tool or whatever.
There's always objections to that, right? On average, men like women, on average, women like men, but there's gay people and there's exceptions. There's bisexual people. And also, if you look at averages, you can talk about men and women on average, but you can also talk about men and women at the tails of the distribution. So men tend to be slightly better at spatial rotation than women are. So if you look at like two different distributions, right? I'll just show you. Right? They can be like super, super similar, right? But then you'll see like a lot of difference out on the tails of the distribution. So even if the differences are very small on average, so for example, girls and boys, not super different in their chess playing ability, but I think there's something like 13 boys for every girl who are like really in the upper echelons of chess. The same thing with kind of spatial rotation, and the same thing with things like, engineering, for example. So what you'll see is that you'll see bigger differences at the tails of the distribution, those people who are the best at things. And the distributions of cognitive characteristics are also somewhat different for men and women. So it could be because an X chromosome doesn't have backup copies. There's this idea that nature takes more risks with men, but there are also more male geniuses and more idiots is the way they say it. So there's more cognitively disabled boys than girls, and there's also more very cognitively gifted boys than girls. And there's also more dyslexic boys, more boys with all kinds of other problems. And of course, it kind of goes without saying, but I'll say anyway, the vast majority of people who are in prison or who have serious mental illness are men.
Why do you think it is that people take such sort of umbrage or offence at the idea of averages, of tendencies in these discussions?
People think that our perception makes reality. So and I've thought about this a lot because I try to sort of see the best in people. If I strongly believed that boys and girls were socialized to be different and that it was causing pervasive inequality, then I would also be very outraged for people to have these kinds of discussions openly, because if socialization creates psychological differences, then speculation or talking about these differences actually is more likely to create reality. So, in my view, we're talking about things that exist in nature. And even if we never talked about these male-female differences, even if there was no stereotypes, in my view, men and women would still be different and boys and girls would still be different, right? But if you have a very strong environmentalist, a strong nurture position, you actually think that the speculation or the stereotypes or this, what they would say, misplaced science or is actually creating the reality. And I think that just speculating about these people's psychology, I would say that they would think that even if these things were true, or even if there were differences, that talking about them exacerbates them. And so we should either not talk about them, or we should say that they don't exist. Because if we say that they don't exist, it's going to make it more likely that they would stop existing. So this is the kind of milieu we're in right now, is where I think if you have this belief that perception creates reality, then you're going to be very strongly invested in how people perceive these differences.
I think it's interesting that the tendency seems to be that, and I think this has something to do with why people find these averages offensive or whatever, is it seems to be that whenever you say something like, you know, if someone makes an assertion like most women would prefer to be at home, be a housewife or something like that, be it have kids, get married, be a caretaker for children or whatever. One of the reasons that's deemed to be an offensive statement to make is that those same people consider that inferior in some way, that there's something inherent in the female experience, or in female biology, maybe female psychology. There's an inferiority to it, or that, and I don't know whether it goes across the political spectrum, maybe. Whereas, you know, me on the right of the political spectrum, I sort of, I think you revere the housewife, and I tend to find women that housewives and are into kids and family and stuff like that. I tend to find them way more attractive when I find that out about them. And for me, there's total equality between the sexes, even if there's not sameness. But I'm just wondering why that seems to be the case, that inherent female traits are viewed as inferior, even by the people that are supposedly sticking up for women.
It was this dad that I know, this older man, says like, oh, men make decisions like how much money to make and what job to have. Women make, totally unimportant decisions like what to eat, how many children to have, where to live. So if you look at kind of division of labor in couples, women do make very important decisions. Okay. So reason
just to throw in there as well, I think women make about 80% of the women have got about 80% of the purchasing power within couples right, and families. So
they choose everything to buy, and that's why all these ads are geared towards women. One thing I think is because there's a bit of a filter. So I speak as somebody like, I'm just now getting married and I'm almost 40. I'm just now thinking about starting a family and I'm almost 40. I really prioritize my career for a really long time compared to anything else. And I've been totally happy with that decision, right? So if I was to extrapolate my experience to other women's experience, I would also say to other women, oh, wait forever to get married and have kids. You'll also be happy like me. And I have a very dear friend who has a PhD in logic and who taught herself to do computer programming. And was like, we would have these arguments, like debates all the time about men and women not being that different. And I said, one reason that you think men and women aren't that different is because you have very masculine typical interests. You're very, you're much more masculine in personality than almost any other woman that I've met. And I'm much more masculine in personality than most women are as well. So when I think about these kinds of, this kind of outrage or these kinds of pronouncements about what men and women want, I think the women who are making these pronouncements are women who have chosen a certain kind of lifestyle. Women who have a family and have kids and are staying at home are generally not like weighing in on important issues about male-female differences because they're doing other stuff, right? Whereas male psychologists oftentimes, have a wife and kid at home and they have chosen to have a family, but they're much less involved with them than their partners are. So I think that that's part of the reason why you see this outrage is because women are saying, if I say, I think women on average are happier spending more time at home or spending more time with their kids. If I said that was the case on average, women who are experts in the field or who have prioritized their career might be outraged because I'm not describing them, because they feel excluded by that description, because I'm talking about averages. I'm not talking about women like myself who are unusual, odd, deviant, whatever you want to call it, right? Another reason for it is, as I said, people say that the perception makes the reality. I don't want to go back to the 1950s or the 1960s, or even if you meet people from the Indian subcontinent, like from Pakistan or Bangladesh or India, where their parents are constantly like, when are you getting married? When are you going to have kids? The people from these kind of traditional societies who feel really badgered by their parents to do traditional family kinds of things. I wouldn't want that. And luckily my parents have never given me any grief about not getting around to giving them grandchildren. Right. So I don't want to go back to that, but I do want some nuance in society about how, yes, some women who prioritize their career are going to be super happy, but there's going to be a lot of women who prioritize their career and they're going to regret it, or they're going to be unhappy. Right.
Isn't this, when you mention India there, with this sort of, not wanting to sort of go back to that ultra conservative lifestyle, I think it might be you that I've read writing something about this, that isn't it true though that the more sort of egalitarian a society becomes, the freer a society becomes, that you would think that the freer the society gets, that more women would choose careers and enter science and those things, economics or whatever it is. But in truth, the more egalitarian a society is, the more sort of traditional the roles are that men and women tend to choose, especially with regards to occupation.
Yeah, so women, there's a bigger gap in STEM in places that are more egalitarian than places that are less egalitarian. And there's also some pervasive sex differences in personality. And you see in more gender egalitarian countries, on average, bigger differences in personality. So if you believe this kind of socializational hypothesis that men and women are socialized to have different personalities, then you would think that more traditional societies would show both women being more likely to engage in traditional roles and also women being more likely to have traditional kind of feminine personalities. And Gina Rippon calls this a paradox. And because I only finished half of her book, I don't actually know if she ever doubled back to it.
Okay, I'm not sure if this is sort of just veering too much into politics, but one sort of criticism of the sort of the feminist agenda, if you like, wanting to help women, be more successful in the careers, get on the corporate ladder, things like that, is feminists don't seem that keen on, in all their arguments about, being equal to men or whatever, there doesn't seem to be very much of a push for getting, we want women in the boardroom and working on Wall Street and things. We want women to be CEOs and entrepreneurs and everything. But no one's asking for women to, be working in the sewers or in construction work and things like that. And I'm just, it makes me wonder whether there's a sort of a snobbery inherent in some of these drives for equality as well. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that there's something going on here. There's a woman named Tanya Reynolds who did some studies about whether or not people care more about men suffering or women suffering. And it does seem like people cared more about women suffering than men suffering, like contra, Kate Mann, who says that people care more about men suffering. And so when you look at the most dangerous jobs there are, things like deep sea fishing, roofing, garbage collectors, those kinds of jobs. Yes, men on average do them much more. And if you look at how many people die on the job, I think it's something like 97% of the people who die in occupational hazards per year are men compared to women. So that's obviously not somewhere where we're calling for egalitarian representation. And it's not essentially about snobbery, but there is still this kind of protectiveness about women. So yeah, women want safe jobs. Another funny thing that I think, speaking of escorts and stuff, is that people are often talking about how dangerous it is to be a prostitute when it's unclear if that job is more dangerous than being a roofer, right? It's probably more dangerous to
Oh,
to build room and to be an escort, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I'd say it depends. There's different levels to it. So I mean, there's your street girls, and then there's your parlor girls, and then there's the escort agencies, and they themselves have got sort of a hierarchy of prestige, I guess.
Yes.
What
People tend to care more about deaths where other people cause death. So like people care less if you fall off a roof and break your neck. People care a lot less about that death than if you're killed by somebody else, right? And something like 30,000 people, a year die on the roads in the United States, and this problem could be solved in part by public transportation. And yet people talk a lot more about how we could solve the problem of men killing women and like domestic violence and domestic abuse than they talk about how, so lives saved is less important to people than preventing certain kinds of deaths over others. Although I think being dead is pretty similar no matter how you die. And I think that people care a lot more about women suffering than men suffering. And I don't think feminists are doing anything to like curb that. That's not a thing. The other thing I think that James Damore talked about, when the whole Damore thing came out, I really despaired because I think it's an 8-page memo.
So do you just want to quickly, I know who James Damore is, but do you just want to quickly summarize that little saga
James
for people?
Damore was a Google employee. Google very foolishly gave their employees like 10% time to work on whatever they wanted. And James Damore used his time to criticize the diversity and sex equality initiatives at Google and talked about sex differences. And then he was outed. It was an internal memo. He ended up getting outed. It was published. It was published without the figures. Very annoying. I think in Vox or somewhere. The figures really made it. And then also most people didn't read it, even though it was only 8 pages long. So James Damore talks towards the end of that memo about ways that you can make programming more attractive to women, given what we know about men and women's personalities, and also the ways that you can make the world more gender egalitarian. And he says very rightly that people are really focused on getting women into like more high status masculine fields, but much less invested in helping men become more feminine, right? So in all societies all over the world, men seek status. If you could make being a stay-at-home dad a very high status occupation, then more men would do it. And the feminist perspective on this that I've seen around is, say like, why should we throw a fucking parade for a man who changes a nappy when women do it all day long? And the reason you should throw a fucking parade for them is because they're much less inclined to do that, naturally. Right. And so if you give men more status, you can be right, or you can get nappies changed. You can get one or the other. Right. And so I think that was one really good point that he made that people largely ignore, is that if we're pushing for women to get into more masculine professions, we have to push for men to get into more feminine professions, things like school teaching, nursing, daycare. And I think one thing that feminists could do to improve this is to just go out on dates with men who have these lower status feminine occupations and get into relationships with them. If a woman wants a man who is going to stay at home and take care of her kids, then she might actually have to get together with somebody who makes less money than her. Or, these are the kinds of trade-offs that women could choose to make.
Yeah, just speaking from sort of personal experience on that, again, this is probably my own socialization going on here. I can see the draw for women getting involved in trying to get a sort of high status career, but I can't see the draw for men engaging in more feminine occupations and pastimes. And I say that as a guy that's been a stay-at-home dad.
Oh, you're a stay-at-home dad?
Yeah, kind of. Awesome. Kind. It's not awesome. Kind of. So I can speak candidly on this. So the way it happened with us. So my little boy's turning 9 tomorrow, and so he was about 2 years old when I gave my job up at one of the escorting agencies. And it was because at the time the agency I was working for wasn't very well run, and it wasn't a secure job. And
I can't imagine.
Hey, some of them are, like one of the ones I was working for has been around for like nearly 40 years. But this one was a bit dodgy and a bit shaky. And so I quit work because it just made more sense that my missus, Leanne, she was in a secure job, even though she was earning less than me. It was just more secure now. We've got a little boy come along. But what happened is, over the years while I'm staying at home looking after him, she's climbing up the ladder and she's earning more and more money. And it's got to the point now where, again, I've got no qualifications. The only thing I'm good at is driving prostitutes around Manchester and making sure they don't get their head kicked in. Seriously, I mean, that's the only thing I'm good at. And the money she's earning now, I can't match that already with getting back into the escorting gig. And if I try and go back into the workplace now, I'm flipping burgers at McDonald's. I'm starting from the bottom. And so, but for me, this past 7 years, it's just been a constant source of embarrassment. I would much rather say, I think it's one of the reasons I ended up doing this, was so I could say I'm doing something else. What do you do for a living? I mean, even this is pathetic. I'm a podcaster at 37 years old. Like, oh, do YouTube. And everyone knows you're not earning any fucking money doing that. But I'd much rather, it's that I would much rather say, like, oust myself as a broke, useless twat than say I'm a stay-at-home dad. And I've struggled with it. And, people say to me, especially like all these liberals that I end up inevitably talking to that infest the psychology and the humanities and stuff. It's fine. You should be proud of it and stuff like that. But I've heard all the arguments and I'm never sold on it. And I just don't buy that. I just don't buy that guys are ever going to be sold on the idea of feminizing themselves. And I wonder if inherent in that, even though I'm arguing that, I see men and women as equals, maybe there's some sexism inherent in that. I mean, what do you think hearing that?
I think it's really good if men are stay-at-home dads. Your audience, or I'm polyamorous. So it was like 3 or 4 years ago, I started dating a stay-at-home dad who was in a totally companionate relationship with his wife. He and his wife were just like totally not romantically involved anymore. So she was dating other people, but he was actually having a lot of trouble dating women, given that he wasn't making any money and he was a stay-at-home dad. And we went out for like a year and a half and it was really nice. And in part, I was like, I want to like show you that I appreciate stay-at-home dads. I'm going to date you. I mean, I liked him for other reasons. Obviously, he was a very nice guy. Great. But I thought, like, if more women did this, if obviously most stay-at-home dads are not polyamorous, but I thought, like, if more women were like, stay-at-home dad, that's well sexy, right?
Yeah, but it's not. No, but right. You see, here's the thing, Diana. I don't buy that you think that for a minute, and there's no way that you would. I don't think you would have dated that guy exclusively if he wasn't in a relationship and it wasn't just sort of I
wouldn't date anybody exclusively.
Right. Okay.
I'm just being ridiculous now.
No, but
I agree with you.
It wouldn't be a stay-at-home dad is never going to be your number one. Even if you're dating a load of guys, he's never going to be the first person you call on a Friday night when you need sorting out. Facts.
Your slang just like totally blew me out of the water. When you need sorting out.
But as funny as that is, that's true. I suspect that's true.
Well, we won't go too much into it, but yes, it was. He was the person I saw. We had dinner once a week and we hung out once a week. Yeah, and it was nice. Whether or not I called him if I needed sorting out, I'm not going to go down that hole. Quick fire questions.
Well, let's jump into those in a minute. I just want to finish. Let's close this out now with some sort of big questions that maybe tie all this together a little bit. On that one, what we're talking about now, how do we disentangle this idea of same versus equal? Because it seems to be that the drive towards equality involves making women the same as men. And I'm wondering how you how you disentangle those, in the sense that how do we make how do we make a woman choosing to become a housewife versus an entrepreneur or whatever, the same sort of an equal choice of occupation? Or is that just a fucking pipe dream and they're just not equal?
I mean, as we just said, there's just so much inconsistency. We're not telling women to be roofers or deep sea fishermen or join the military or whatever other risky occupations that men take up. We're asking, we're trying to increase, feminism and the society at large is trying to increase women's representation in male-dominated fields that are safe and high prestige.
But
right?
do you know anything about whether that's making people happy? Like, is it working? Are the women in general, the women that are entering the workplace and doing these, prestigious careers or whatever, are they reporting back that they're happy with it? Or are we getting a lot of women saying, regretting it?
There's I don't really know of any straightforward data about this particular issue. It'd be amazing to do studies where we ask women these questions. I know from personal experience that women that I know who said, I was working a lot and then I started taking flex time. I took a $20,000 a year pay cut, but I spend an extra day a week with my kids, and I would make that decision over and over again. Right. So I do know women who make such decisions. I also know that women's prevalence of depression has not decreased since women have joined the workforce. I don't know if it's increased, but it doesn't actually seem like women in the workforce are less likely to become depressed. And of course, if I was going to steel man that issue, I would say women are depressed in the workforce because they're discriminated against or because they don't get the same opportunities as men, not necessarily because work, life, and status striving and rat race and all that stuff is making them less happy than they would otherwise be in a more family oriented domestic kind of situation. Here, I'm not saying, that all women would prefer to be at home with their families. I'm just saying that if you even look at women, on average, who are at the very top 1% of mathematical ability. So these are probably women who are somewhat masculinized compared to the average woman anyway. Those women, there's just a huge difference between how much time they say that they would prefer to spend with their families than men do. So again, I'm not saying this is for every woman. Certainly these are not the choices that I've made.
So would you say that in general, that a lot of these efforts, like you say, that are focused on women in particular, is it going against biology, in the sense that we're sort of fighting a futile battle, maybe, that just can't be won with all the politics and arguments and sophistry in the world isn't gonna, it isn't ultimately going to work.
Are we fighting an argument? Are we fighting a battle against biology? I mean, yes, to some extent. So it used to be, I think, like at the very tails of mathematical ability, I think the SAT, it used to be that there were 13 boys for every one girl. And now it's 3 boys for every one girl. So it does seem like there have been some strides in terms of society, and that culture and social progress have made a difference in how well represented women are. What I'm saying is that there is a limit on how much culture and society can actually change the degree of representation of men and women in fields, and can change the occupational interests and personality differences between men and women. And if you keep pushing against that, you're going to start doing things that have bad unintended consequences. So one possibility, and again, there's no data on this, is that if women are strongly incentivized to join the labor market or to work as many hours as men are, that they're going to be doing things that potentially make them less happy or less satisfied with their lives. And it's potentially the case that if women choose more traditional occupations or choose a more traditional life path, that they might feel less satisfied with that because they feel that they have been socialized into making those choices, that those choices were not their own, and that there's no reason for them to have made those choices other than that society railroaded them into that particular occupation.
Well,
so
yeah, that brings us perfectly onto this closing question, which is, again, quoting you, gender equality is not necessarily the most important thing. Happiness is.
Yeah. Sorry, that's my view. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm just thinking, maybe at the individual level, if you've got a woman there who is sort of faced with this dilemma of, the idea wanting to do something maybe more traditional, get married, have a family, have kids and what have you, but also feels the sort of the pull of the corporate world as well. And, she might not necessarily be able to disentangle whether it's socialization or whether it's biology or whatever. And when a woman has got those pressures bearing down on her from either side or whatever, what do you do? And how do you find that happiness?
Yeah. Well, I think that this conversation that we keep having of people saying there's no psychological differences between men and women, and other people saying there are pervasive psychological differences between men and women, these conversations are disproportionately impacting very highly intelligent women, and women who are more educated are more likely to believe these sex differences are the result of socialization, as opposed to more innate, not necessarily totally innate, kinds of factors. And I think they're going to be disproportionately influenced by these things. In fact, if you get very little education, you're probably just more likely to believe that these sex differences are natural, and you're less likely to be fraught about whether you choose a career or choose a family, right? Because compared to women who are more educated and who are more well-versed in these kinds of arguments. So this is something that, I don't know how the kind of average career-oriented women perceives it, how much it makes a difference in her life. Or, if I'm wringing my hands for no reason, maybe women who are making these career choices are thinking about things not in terms of how do I be a good feminist, but just, what do I feel is going to make me happy? But overall, I think that the kind of story of discrimination it was important to get us to this point, but we're never going to close the gap. And if we keep trying to make interventions to close the gap, or keep using rhetoric to try and say there should be no gaps at all in the boardroom, in who takes care of children, in any of these different occupations, then that is likely to cause harm, because people won't feel free in their choices, and because people will be doing things that they won't necessarily feel naturally inclined to do.
Okay, right. Let's jump into the quickfire questions. And I've just realised we are a pair of sexist bastards, because we just answered that question purely worrying about the happiness of women, and I didn't ask the question about men's happiness, and you didn't even bring it up. So we are
men kill themselves at greater rates. That's fine. No, I want people to take me out of context. I don't think that greater male suicide is okay, everybody. I think men and women should kill themselves at the same rate.
Oh, and there's a joke we couldn't have made before today's episode. I'm definitely leaving that in. Okay, here we go. Quickfire questions.
Yeah.
What is the best book you've ever read, and why?
Oh, hard pass.
Okay.
I really love The Selfish Gene. I'll just say The Selfish Gene. I really love The Selfish Gene.
Why though?
Why? Because it gave me a view, like a gene's eye view of human behavior that I didn't have before. And I read it, when I was pretty young. And so it has had a pretty pervasive influence on things that I've thought ever since then. Just trying to think about another book that when I was a kid, I had a book called The Evolution Book by a woman called Sarah Stein. And I carried it around with me like a teddy bear. Like I had it with me all the time. I was obsessed with it. And so, I would say that The Evolution Book, 7.
Oh, wow. That's quite precocious.
I was really obsessed with it. 7, 8, something like that. And it had all kinds of interesting factoids in it. The one that I remember most was about how avocados would have gone extinct if, because ground sloths went extinct, and they were the ones that were big enough to eat the seeds of the avocado and disperse them. And avocados would have gone extinct if humans had not come along sometime later. Yeah.
Right, okay. Interesting little factoid there. Okay, I'm going to have to modify this one. It used to be mental health related. If you could be dictator for a day, but only implement one policy, one governmental policy, what would it be?
If I could be dictator, but I had to implement only one, end factory farming.
Okay, go on. Why is that?
I just think it causes just like a huge amount of suffering, and people don't really think about animal suffering that much, but it's just a huge problem. I would ideally like in the future for people to only eat meat that was cultured, like that is grown as opposed to like grown off the back of an animal, because I don't think that we should create animal suffering. And 99% of animals are factory farmed. I don't think people have the psychology to take good care of animals that they intend to use for food on average. I think animals suffer terribly when they are used in that way. And even if you think a pig's suffering is, 1/100th or 1/1000th of what a human's is, you start talking about suffering on the order of billions, if not trillions. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's the same answer that David Benatar gave. I don't know if you're familiar with David Benatar, the antenatal.
David Benatar talked about factory farming?
Yeah, he's.
I thought he would say sterilize everybody.
Yeah, I think that would be his answer to it. Just nobody coming into existence in the first place. Yeah. But he's big on ending animal suffering. Yeah. What negative experience has had the most positive effect on your life? See, now I'm just gonna intervene a little bit here. There's a big grin on your face when I first asked that, and then you thought about it. And my experience is that you might just have gone for an answer sprang to mind, and then you went, "No, I can't give that one," and then you come down the ladder.
I'm thinking about two experiences. I'm hyperthymic. I smile all the time. I have like an artificially elevated mood, and even when I think about the worst thing that ever happened to me, it makes me laugh. Two things I'm thinking about. One thing is that when I was a kid, I fell off a horse and I got the wind knocked out of me. And I definitely thought I was going to die. And I was trying to give my last words to my horseback riding teacher. I was like holding on to her, right? And I thought I was going to die. Because to me, like no breathing means, no one ever told me about getting the wind knocked out of you before. And so when I didn't die, I was like really happy I didn't die. Like I was really grateful. So that's like one experience
do you remember what your final words were?
I don't even remember what I was going to say. I think I was going to say something like, "Tell my mother I love her." No, I don't know what I was going to say. But yeah, I was trying to formulate my last words, and I was like 10 years old. Another experience I had is that I was looking after my grandpa when he was dying, and my grandma came by, and my grandfather was like really terrible to look after as he was dying. He was just like restless, and he wouldn't sleep all night, and he slept all day, and it was and he only spoke German to me. He was like being really impossible. And my grandma came by and gave him a Valium. And we hung out all day, like for like 3 or 4 hours. He was really chill, and we just sat back to back and just kind of breathed together and meditated together. And even though it was bad, like he was dying, I think that I really treasure that memory with him when he took that Valium about 2 weeks before he died. Yeah. Wow.
Okay. What's the best piece of life advice anyone's ever given you?
Man, I wish you had told me about these before. Jesus Christ.
Another one is, if nothing springs to mind, I often substitute is, what quote resonates with you the most?
I think one that I've been thinking about recently in terms of life advice and quote is something to the effect of, don't believe everything you think because you're the easiest person to fool. So this is something that I think about a lot, is about how I'm self-deceived. So the other day, I've been writing this kind of How to Train Your Boyfriend book. And this friend of mine, I was talking about how I started dating somebody I had been dating seriously, more casually. And then he kept saying like, "Oh, that guy trained you. He trained you to like see him however he wanted to see you." And I got incredibly annoyed. And it was actually really instructive because I realized actually how annoying it was potentially when I said that to other people and how they might object to that. So I was actually really grateful when this guy annoyed me. And I think when you think about if you have a very strong negative reaction and pick that apart, that's been one of the best lessons that I've ever learned. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you feel outraged.
Yeah, it's really the sort of the essence of cognitive behavioral therapy. That.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Okay. What mistakes do you continue to make despite knowing better?
Watching YouTube.
What's your vice on YouTube?
I just have a vice. So a few vices that I have. I know 100% that if I wake up first thing in the morning and I check Twitter, that my day is like not going to be, at best, it's going to be 30% as productive as a day in which I do not do that. I know for a fact that if I watch YouTube first thing in the morning or do anything like that, my day is going to be less productive. I know that the best days I have start off with me meditating. That's the best thing that I do. And yet it's very hard for me to make good choices. And that's part of what I actually have kind of roped people I live with into helping me make better choices. I lock myself out of my phone. And that's the best thing that I can do is lock myself out of my phone first thing in the morning. So that is a mistake that I keep making. And there's a really good book by this guy called Robert Kurzban called Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite. And he talks about how we have a modular mind. So why do you have to lock the fridge if you're on a diet? If you're on a diet, don't you want to not eat? And there's like different yous. And there's a me that wants to watch YouTube. And then there's a me that actually wants to get things done. And they're in tension with each other.
What is a harsh truth you choose to ignore, but know you shouldn't?
A harsh truth I choose to ignore. I don't know. It's very hard for me to believe that anything that is a harsh truth. I mean, so I'm pretty good at like swallowing red pills generally. I have a very cynical view of my own behavior. Even the nice things that I do, I try and pick them apart and think about, in what way I'm being selfish. But I guess say that like no one ever really truly understands you. That's something that I don't really believe, but then I sometimes do believe that there's some tension about that. Yeah.
What do you know to be true that most other people think is bollocks?
What do I know to be true? That everything you do has a selfish motivation. That there is no such thing as altruism. There's always a cynical interpretation of what you do. And that if you understand the cynical reasons why you do things, you can make yourself better and you can get what you want in ways that don't involve self-deception, that you can self-deceive yourself better, I actually think. So you can change the way that you view your own behavior to get what you actually want rather than what you fooled yourself into thinking that you want. So you can better signal to other people about how virtuous you are.
Yeah. Have you read any Ayn Rand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was really into Ayn Rand when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
Like all other little libertarians.
Okay. Final three.
Yeah.
What, if anything, keeps you up at night?
Nothing. I sleep very well. I guess.
I'm so jealous of that answer. Sleep like shit.
I sometimes, think that I should have like more food stores. Like I should prep more for disasters. Or like I'm planning a wedding right now. That's horrible. Speaking of sex differences, people are always talking about like gender roles, and I've never felt more sort of shamed as a woman than I have when they're like, what's your preference about how we're going to decorate the tables? I'm like, what if I don't care? What if I don't care at all? And so I feel like my lack of concern about it is concerning, but I think it's all going to be fine. It really matters, the food and who gets married matters most.
Okay. Outside of family and career, what investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment?
Meditating.
Any particular approach to it?
Yeah, I've been on 3 Vipassana retreats, and I do. It's just on retreat, you just get so much kind of deep work done and insight, and it is also kind of unglamorous, and you feel like shit a lot of the time. But it has been really good. I also think, and I'm not going to get into it too much, but probably psychedelics. Yeah.
Okay. Final question, the big one. What do you
Sure.
think is the key to happiness?
Your genetically predisposed temperament.
Really?
Yeah, I mean,
Do you think that your level of happiness is predetermined?
I think my hedonic set point's really high, and it's always been this way. I was born like this. Yeah. And it does actually skew my views somewhat. I have to also think about it. You know, how earlier we were talking about how women who have masculine preferences and masculine personalities often are more likely to think that there are fewer sex differences. In the same way, I also, so my fiance, Jeffrey Miller, sometimes rails against brutalism and like brutalist buildings. And he's like, oh my gosh, this architecture makes people so unhappy. And for me, I don't care that much about where I live or like how it looks aesthetically. And he said before that this is one of several areas that my perception is skewed, because I'd probably be happy to live in a concrete building. Like it probably wouldn't bother me that much. And I've just always been, even when I was a baby, I was really happy. I never had stranger anxiety. When I was 18 months old, you could, when kids really have stranger anxiety, you could literally like pass me to strangers and I would treat them like my parents. Like I didn't care. So I've always been this way. And I think it makes a huge difference. I think that, talking about people like, David Benatar and David Pearce, who's another kind of transhumanist philosopher. I am a transhumanist, and I think it would be really wonderful if people could be genetically engineered to experience greater happiness. Because I do think that the evidence shows this, that, hedonic set point is a thing.
Right, so there you go. That's a nice reassuring final message for all the people with chronic depression out there. You're fucked. Diana's fine. Anyway, see, I enjoy being able to say things like that now. Anyway, Diana, before I let you go, chance to sort of plug away, let the viewers, the listeners know any websites, YouTube channels, projects, social media, anything like that. Just plug away, please.
Sure. Yeah. So my Twitter is at Sentientist, Sentientist, Sentientist. And I have some blogs in the pipeline that I'm going to be releasing. I also have some YouTube videos that I will be releasing, but those projects are still on their way out. I don't know when this is coming out.
I don't know when this is coming out, to be honest.
So yeah, just check my Twitter. That's my Twitter has all that stuff. And DianaFleischman.com is also where I plug stuff that I've written and where you can find my papers and other media. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And I'll have to throw a recommendation in there for, I think it's your blog. I've read quite a few of your articles on there. Very diverse writer and thinker. So, yeah. Okay, Diana Fleischman, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Danny.
Ring, ring, go away. Come again.